and we're joined by a very special guest here today on the podcast. You might recognize him from Between the Benches on NBC's hockey coverage. It's Pierre McGuire, a hockey analyst for NBC Sports Network. And Pierre, thanks for joining us today.
Jack, it's a pleasure to be with you. I hope you and yours are safe and sound, and everybody in the Dubuque area is very safe and sound.
Yeah, absolutely. You as well, Pierre. Again, really appreciate you taking the time to talk some hockey, with hopefully hockey right on the horizon. And you maybe more so than anyone else we've had on this podcast or in general their life is hockey. So what have the last 3 months been like without hockey, without sports in general for you?
It's in the last 32 years that I've been in the National Hockey League, it's the longest I've been without being on an airplane. It's the most time I've spent with my wife in the 22 years we've been married. It's definitely the most time I've spent with my children because they've been away. My daughter's a freshman in college, and my son's been at prep school the last 4 years, and also has played in your league in the USHL. So it's been kind of an interesting time being around my family and actually being able to be a father and a husband. It's been really neat.
So the season drops off right before the most exciting time of the year. I mean, the playoff push is just starting for a lot of these teams. You have so many good races that you're following along. When that stoppage happened, what was the immediate reaction from you? And when talking to players and coaches, what was that feel within 24, 48 hours to when they knew the season wasn't going to continue as planned?
What a good question, Jack. I was actually doing a game between the Philadelphia Flyers and the Boston Bruins for NBC Sports in the afternoon when things started to look pretty bad. I was actually sitting in the Bruins dressing room talking to Zdeno Chara at about 2:30 in the afternoon on game day. He said he wanted to get to the rink early and just kind of stretch out and get a feel for the game. And it just shows you the intensity level of Big Z. And then it started to filter around down by both dressing rooms that things were not getting very good with the coronavirus around everywhere. And then there was a breaking story out of the NBA. And all of a sudden the guys were like, are we going to be playing in the game tonight? And then obviously the game was played. I did all my interviews as usual. And then found out the next day that the league, there was going to be a pause, obviously. So that was really foreign territory, I think, for everybody in the National Hockey League. We just weren't used to that. Mm-hmm. And most people probably thought it was going to be, a 1 or 2 week thing. And then all of a sudden it became, pretty darn serious. And then schools started to close, and it became very, very serious, obviously.
I'm sure the discussion then is different because, like you mentioned, and I felt the same way, we're on a bus trip to Youngstown. The season gets paused. We head right back to Dubuque, and I'm thinking, okay, I'll be here in Dubuque for maybe a week, and then things start to sort themselves out. Suddenly I'm back home in Virginia with a season canceled. So then talking to players a week or 2 weeks after, I mean, how did that mentality shift from hopefully this is a week-long thing to we don't know when hockey's coming?
Well, when I found out we were on the pause, I actually came up to Boston to come visit my son, who was still in prep school, and I was skating with him really early in the morning at a rink that a friend of mine owns. And all of a sudden, Brad Marchand walks into the rink, and we start chatting. I've known Brad a long time, and we start chatting. And he says, "I wish I can go on the ice. We're not allowed. We're not allowed to go on the ice. We're not even supposed to be in the rink." He was actually bringing his young son to a skating clinic before the rinks got closed in Massachusetts. And he said he'd never gone through anything like it in his life, and he wasn't sure how long it was going to last, and he was really concerned about it because he didn't want to lose his edge. I mean, if you look at the Bruins and the kind of season they were having, Jack, and you look at the way Brad was playing in particular, I mean, he was having a phenomenal year, along with David Pastrnak and Patrice Bergeron, could be argued the best line in the National Hockey League. Mm-hmm. So just to give you a case in point about a player, there was an elite player in the league who had no idea what was going on, and he was really concerned about it.
When you get the season pause, I mean, what teams do you think were most negatively affected by that pause? You mentioned the Bruins. They had been streaking all season. Were there certain teams that you felt, wow, they were about to get on a hot streak and maybe make a deep run that might have been negatively impacted by this?
I thought the Washington Capitals were a really good team throughout most of the year. They had a couple little peaks and valleys, but I thought by and large they were pretty consistent, and I thought they were a team that when the pause was coming, they were actually starting to go up. Tampa Bay was another one. They were starting to really ascend. Toronto was starting to play a little bit better. I think they were encouraged by it. I look at out west, boy, Vegas was playing phenomenal hockey. Edmonton was starting to play better. So I think those were two teams in the West. Vancouver's another one that started to play better. Nashville under John Hines. So I think all those teams that I just talked about, they wanted to keep going. Jack and he weren't able to.
When you look at this, you mentioned it was unprecedented. I mean, is there anything that even comes close to a comparable for you in your time playing hockey, covering hockey, being around the sport?
I remember 05, 06, the entire year. I call it the nuclear winter when we didn't have hockey. The players kind of knew they were in for the long haul, but it still was, everybody thought somebody would blink, whether it be the Players Association or the owners. Nobody ever thought they'd miss an entire year. And then when it got to November and December and nobody blinked, I was working for Canadian TV at the time, and they said, they called me up and they said, you and your partner, Gordon Miller, are going to do the Women's World Championships, the Men Under 18 World Championships, and the World Championships for the men. So we were in Europe for 2 months. And that's when I kind of knew this is for real. We're going to miss the entire season. So I've been through it before. When I was coaching in the playoffs with Pittsburgh back in '92, there was a player strike, believe it or not, just before the playoffs. And so we were a little bit late getting to the playoffs. That's in '92, by the way, is the first time an NHL game was ever played in June. June 1st is when the Pittsburgh Penguins won the Stanley Cup. And the reason why that happened is because of that player strike just before the playoffs started. So I've been through some of these things before, but never because of a pandemic. I've been through SARS. I've been through the bird flu. I've been through all this stuff, and we've never had a cancellation or a pause like we have right now.
And when you're looking at, you mentioned the lockout season, how different is this still? Because I'm assuming in that lockout season, not assuming, I know that, players were still able to work out. They could even go overseas and play in other leagues. This is a full shutdown where ice rinks are closed. I mean, how many players have you talked to that had big lulls of even being able to do anything hockey related?
Well, I'll tell you what, especially in Canada, my 83-year-old mother lives in downtown Montreal, and good portions of Canada had very major quarantining laws. So a lot of the players couldn't do anything if they had gone home. Another thing that is really important to stress is that guys from Sweden, and I know there was a charter plane that left Nashville with a bunch of Swedish-born players. They went over and they could skate because their country never closed. So some guys actually went back to Sweden and skated. But for good many of them, there was no ice availability. Unless you were an injured player and had rehab opportunity, that's the only way you could get on an NHL ice surface. So it's been really tough that way. I do think most of the guys have tried to stay in shape, at least over the first month and a bit. But, Jack, I'll be honest with you, it's going to be hard for a lot of these guys to get back in shape. They're in full-time summer mode. They really are.
Yeah, and we'll get into the hopeful restart of a season here coming up. But before we do that, I want to backtrack way back. For fans that know you between the bench, that's one thing. But I want to get through Pierre McGuire's hockey story before NBC, if you'd indulge me a little bit. You started playing college hockey at Hobart from 1979 to 1982. Take us through the college years as a defenseman.
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I was on the first ever varsity team there. I played football, hockey, and baseball in college, which is probably a foreign concept to a lot of your viewers, but I was able to do it. My body wasn't always able to do it, but I was able to do it, so that was cool. Most of my best friends in my life are my hockey teammates from college. We did some really good things there. I was really proud of, being part of the first ever program there, and to see where the program's gone today to being, one of the better programs at that level in the country makes me really proud. So I enjoyed it, and I was really, I felt very, very fortunate to graduate from a great institution like Hobart.
Was it after you graduated Hobart that you realized that coaching and scouting might be the path for you, or while you were playing, did you kind of figure that out?
Well, I turned pro right after my senior year, and I signed with a European team and had a real good first year there, and was signed by the New Jersey Devils in the National Hockey League. And I figured out probably middle part of the first training camp in New Jersey. I had been there in the spring after my European season, so finished off the year there. And then I went to training camp, and I kind of figured out that I did not want to take the minor league route. I just didn't want to do it. You get in so many different physical battles over time. That wasn't the path I wanted to do. So where I figured out I really wanted to coach was probably halfway through training camp in New Jersey. So that would have been in '84, where I kind of figured out, and I went right into coaching and never looked back.
Did you ever think of doubling back to try the football route, or was that long gone by the
No,
time?
that was long. Football was long gone. I love football. I mean, I was probably, pretty decent player. I played with some really good players over time, but no, the hockey was what I really wanted to be involved in.
So when you get your start in coaching, take us through those first couple years of, I think I've talked to a lot of coaches where they say, they have a moment where they realize, hey, this is exactly what I want to do. They realize that they can make it in coaching. When did you have that breakthrough point?
Right away, I knew it. I loved working at hockey camps. I loved working with children. I loved trying to help make players better. And I wasn't doing it for the money, trust me. I think you probably have gone through the same thing with your broadcast career. I kind of knew I wanted to do it when the first job I had is I had a meal ticket. I had an apartment paid for. I had a recruiting car, and I made $400 for the year. But I was a substitute school teacher, and I made $50 a day. And that helped get me through. That's when I knew I really wanted to do it. I knew I wasn't putting any money in the bank, but I knew I had the passion to do it. And then the next year I got an amazing opportunity to go to Boston and work with Steve Sterling at Babson College. And we had amazing success there as a school and as a hockey program. And then I went from there to St. Lawrence, where, we were one of the best teams, if not the best team in the country for the 2 years I was there in Division I. And then I got hired by the Pittsburgh Penguins. So it was a gradual blooming to the NHL, but I knew right from the start that I really wanted to do that.
Who were a couple of the formative figures in your coaching career who shaped you early on?
I would say Steve Sterling at Babson College, who was a tremendous player at Boston University and a legendary minor league player, for the Boston Bruins organization. He had really good numbers in the American Hockey League as a player. And then I went up to St. Lawrence and I worked for a living legend in Joe Marsh, who's just a phenomenal person. And Joe just had major heart surgery. He's doing very well, but, I think of Joe often. And then obviously being hired by Scotty Bowman and working with Scotty Bowman and the late Badger Bob Johnson and Craig Patrick from hockey, Hall of Fame career type general manager and a legend from the 1980 Olympic team. So I've been really fortunate to have some amazing role models and people have been really good to me over time.
Ultimate goal for anyone in hockey, whether it's a player, a scout, a coach, a GM, is winning the Stanley Cup. You were able to do so as an assistant coach with the Penguins in 1992. What was that season like? How early on did you know that was going to be a special season? And then when it finally comes full circle at the end, what's the ultimate feeling?
You know what? The first one in 91, I was a scout and I was all over the world. It's kind of an interesting change of how it all happened, Jack. The late Bob Johnson, Scotty Bowman, and Craig Patrick called me up. I was actually over in Sweden. They said, we want you to come back and do all our advanced scouting and run the team meetings before the teams go into the playoff series that they were about to play. So I spent the last 10 days of the NHL season watching the Washington Capitals and the New Jersey Devils. It looked like we were going to play one of those two teams in the first round. We eventually got New Jersey in the first round and then played Washington in the second round. And I went back to Europe for a couple of days. Then I came back and got ready for the conference final, which was against Boston. Then finally we played Minnesota in the final. So I was on the road the entire time. But what I found fascinating and really interesting was just doing the breakdowns, not watching anybody but our next opponent. And it was just a phenomenal exercise and experience. And so the first cup was the one that I really was like, whoa, this is amazing. This actually happened. And then the late Badger Bob Johnson passed away as a head coach. And I was supposed to be the head coach of our team in Muskegon, Michigan for the 91-92 year. And then I got a call in Muskegon during training camp to meet Scotty Bowman in Toronto. So I flew to Toronto. And they said, bring your skates. And I did. And I met him at Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens. And right after the game, we were watching Buffalo play Toronto in a preseason game. He said, you're coming with me to Pittsburgh tonight. You're going to be announced as my assistant coach tomorrow. So that's how it happened. It was kind of a funky deal, but it was really neat, really, really neat.
As a scout, I'm sure that there are a lot of instances where it's really tough to discern, is this guy going to be an NHLer over this guy? But I also know there are definitely instances where you know immediately this guy's got it and he's going to be better than a lot of other players. Were there a couple players in your scouting time that you knew immediately that they're going to be top-level NHL players for a long time?
Oh yeah, one of the first guys I ever saw in the scouting situation was Eric Lindros. I saw him when he was 15 years of age, playing for St. Michael's College School in Toronto. And as a 15-year-old playing against 18 and 19-year-olds, he was just running roughshod over them. You could tell right away he was going to be a living legend. Watching Peter Forsberg play up in Modo and Ormskolvik in Sweden with his line mate Marcus Naslund. I was part of the management team that drafted Marcus Naslund. We wanted to take Forsberg, but Inga Hammerstrom was a scout for Philadelphia, and they took him really early. I think they took Forsberg at 6, and we were picking at 16, I believe. So we took his line mate Naslund, who turned out to be a pretty good
What a terrible
player.
consolation prize there.
Yeah, pretty good. And probably going back to the first draft I ever worked was a 1990 draft. Jaromir Jagr, we took him 5th overall. And what I remember the most about that, the night before the draft, Scotty Bowman had just been hired. I had just been hired. And Greg Malone was the chief scout, and we were talking about who we were going to take at 5. And they said, "Are you sure he's the best player?" Because I said, "Jagr's the best player in the draft." And they said, "Okay, if you're sure, we're all sure. We all agree." And then the next day, I can just do it off of memory. Owen Nolan went 1 to Quebec. Peter Nedved went number 2 to Vancouver. Keith Primo went number 3 to Detroit. And Mike Ricci went number 4 to Philadelphia. And then with the 5th pick overall, the Pittsburgh Penguins were proud to select Jaromir Jagr. And then the Islanders with number 6 took a young man by the name of Scott Sissons, who never played. So it just shows you how fickle the draft can really be. It's an amazing exercise.
You mentioned that a guy 6 overall never plays in the NHL. When you're scouting, what are the small little things that you really try to look at that tell you this guy's going to make it, even though he's not as noticeable as a Lindros or a Jagr?
Yeah, what a good question, Jack. I think the biggest thing is, well, there's 2 things: character and coachability. I call it CNC. If a player's got character, it's going to stand out, because we're a sport that has no out of bounds. You run into a wall. People play hard. They play through you. They have a weapon in their hand called a stick. They're traveling at a high rate of speed, 25 to 30 miles an hour when collisions happen. It's an intensity sport. It's an intimidation sport. So character matters a lot. But a long time ago, I learned as a coach that if a player's not coachable, he can have all the skill in the world, but if he's not prepared to listen and sacrifice, then he's not going to be able to help you become the team you need to be, and he's not going to become the player he can be. The great Jerry York, who's a Hockey Hall of Famer, got in last year, the head coach at Boston College, coach at Clarkson, coach at Bowling Green, coach at Boston College. He once told me, he goes, "I really believe in recruiting good people." And I asked him, "Why is that?" And he says, "Because I know a good person will be receptible to ideas. And because of that, they'll be coachable." And it really does matter. So I think the 2 things that you really look for when you're evaluating players is character and coachability.
I think you mentioned this to me when you came and visited Dubuque last season, was that you said a lot of scouts are sitting up high and watching the game from up top. You like to sit close to the glass because you wanted to see if the players were communicating with each other. How important is that at the next level?
It's gigantic, and communication, because everything goes so quickly right now. If you don't communicate very well and utilize your vocal cords, the buildings are so loud around the league that if you're not yelling and screaming and trying to help your teammate, then it's not going to be very fruitful. And on the bench as well, if players don't communicate well on the bench and they don't listen to their coach, chances are they're going to make a lot of mistakes, because adjustments happen all the time in NHL games. So those are 2 big things: communicating on the ice and communicating and listening off the ice. Really important.
You mentioned character and coachability, which I'm sure from when you were a scout till now hasn't changed in what you're looking at as a player, but the game has evolved so much. What are certain things scouts look for now that they weren't looking for back when you were a scout?
Smaller defensemen can survive in the league now. They couldn't when I was in, because of the red line. The 2-line pass was in effect, so you could basically tackle somebody in the neutral zone, and there wasn't going to be a whole lot of speed generated, and there wasn't going to be any penalties. But you had to have big guys that can really dominate board play, dominate the slot, and so it was really tough for smaller defensemen to make it. So one of the things I've seen, one of the bigger transitions, has been the evolving play of smaller defensemen, puck transporters or puck movers is what they call them now. So that's a big thing that's changed. The other thing is the ability of the 2-way centerman. Maybe it's because of Guy Carbonneau, got in the Hockey Hall of Fame last year. Maybe it's because of Patrice Bergeron. Maybe it's because of Alex Barkov. Maybe it's because of Anse Kopitar. Jonathan Taves in Chicago. the evolving play of the two-way center, where they're maybe not getting the most amount of points, but they're really able to play in every facet of the game. I think that's something that's really evolved. And then finally, the pace of the game, the skating ability of the players. Those are three of the things that I think have really changed: the puck moving defenseman, the two-way center, and the pace of the game.
Talk about all these iconic players that once started off in some form of junior hockey, most likely. I want to dive into the USHL a little bit. I know you're familiar with the league, not just from broadcasting, but also your son, Ryan McGuire, has played 8 games with the Madison Capitals in the USHL. What was your knowledge of the league before Ryan became a player in it? What stood out to you?
Oh, I've known it since I was a college coach, and always respected the players that came out of the league. The thing that stands out is the pace of the game. The pace of the game is unbelievably good, and the physicality of the league is outstanding. So those are two things that really stand out, and how tough the young men have to be. I mean, you're on the bus, those are some long trips, and it's not always easy, especially in the middle part of winter. So I really respect any of the young men that are playing out in that league. It's a tremendous league, but I think of all the great players that have played in that league over time that have eventually gone on to play in the NHL and be really good, dominant players. I think of Johnny Gaudreau. I think of Max Pacioretty. Even though he didn't have a long career, I think about Louis LeBlanc, how well he played over time in the league. I can keep going, but the biggest thing is so many good players have played in the league and done so well at the next level.
From when you first had familiarity with the league to now, how much has it grown in the national spotlight and in the hockey world?
There's a level of professionalism in the USHL now that maybe wasn't there when it first started. It grew, obviously. And I was in your building in Dubuque right around St. Patrick's Day, and I was just blown away, whether how you carried yourself, Jack, or how the people around the building carried themselves. The level of play was fantastic. The promotion, the in-house promotion, the in-game excitement. I was really excited. I was blown away by it. And, I've been to games in Youngstown. I've been to games in Madison. I've been to games in a lot of places, Fargo. I just think it's really an interesting and awesome place.
You have the NTDP as part of the USHL, which has churned out great player after great player. Phil Kessel, Patrick Kane, Austin Matthews played there for a season, Clayton Keller more recently. But then you also have a lot of these other teams. Waterloo Blackhawks are one that I think of immediately, with Brock Besser and Joe Pavelski, who played from them. I mean, can you give us a sense of, for people that might not know or even know the USHL but can only think NTDP, of just how many players are coming from these other teams?
Yeah, no, well, Waterloo is one of the best because they have a guy that's amazingly professional, PK O'Hanley, who runs their team. And, I got asked by PK probably 3 or 4 years ago, around and talked to the team. And one of their top players at the time was Jack Drury, who's now playing at Harvard and was drafted in the second round by Carolina. And I coached his father. I'm dating myself now, but I coached his father in Hartford, and I coached his father in Ottawa, Teddy. So I'm a big fan of the Drury family. But no, there's so many franchises. I look at Chicago Steel and what they're doing right now. And, look, we haven't had this summer's draft yet. At some point we will have it, though, Jack. We will. And they're looking at, 2 or 3 guys from their roster who may go in the first or second round. Sammy Colangelo is one of them that I think about, an unbelievable goal scorer, kid from the Massachusetts area that played at Lawrence Academy, plays for Chicago Steel now. And they're just loading up again for next year. I know they're getting a player by the name of Ian Moore, who's a Boston kid who will probably be drafted in the second or third round in this summer's draft. And that's just one of them. But, you look at it going forward, I mean, the league just keeps getting better and better all the time.
How much has the marriage of going to the USHL and then taking your path towards college hockey done for both growing the USHL, but also for growing college hockey as well?
Oh, college hockey's gotten so much better because of it. You're getting more mature players that are playing, and you see NHL teams aren't afraid to take older players now that maybe have been undrafted, that have come through the USHL route, spent an extra year maybe in the USHL. They end up going to a good college team and then eventually sign as a free agent out of a college. And I think the USHL has played a pretty significant role in that. The best draft in NHL history is 2003. And I think of one of the better players you had who came out of your league at that time was David Backes. And David Backes is a guy who was a third-round pick, I believe, in that draft. You'd have to go look it up, either late second or early third. And David's had just an amazing career. But I can tell you right now, if it's not for the USHL, he may never have had that career. So I think there's a lot to what you're talking about in terms of a marriage between the USHL and college, and how that's really helped college hockey a lot.
Your son played in the USHL. He's going to play college hockey. And what's it been like to follow his hockey journey as a parent, having gone through a lot of the things he's going through right now?
You know, I've tried to stay out of it. I give him advice when he asks for it, but I work with him on the ice. So the only rule we have in our house, when we get to the rink, I'm not his father. I'm his coach. So you can't take it personal if I get mad at you. And it's worked for us. It's worked really well. I get great pleasure watching him. I'm really proud of him. He is going to spend 1 year in the British Columbia League. He's actually going to BC to play in Penticton next year. And part of that was just because of he wanted to try that league, and the coach at the college where he is are going to be going at Colgate. They endorsed that. So we're excited for him. But yeah, no, I've been really proud to watch him grow as a player and grow as a person. He hasn't had it easy. I mean, he's my son, and he gets a lot of lip service from a lot of guys around the league. That's okay. He's handled it really well. So that's been good. Really good.
Well, Pierre, we thank you for taking the time here today. I just have a couple more questions.
Sure.
I want to round back and finish this off with some NHL talk because, again, hopefully the season is starting up sooner rather than later. There's a plan in place. They're narrowing down host cities. They have a structure and a format. First question would be, when you found out that that was the structure they were going with, 24 teams, a massive tournament, what was your first thought about it all?
I thought it was actually really smart. There's no perfect solution to what's going on right now, Jack, with the coronavirus. And I thought that was a really good compromise, both by the players and by the owners. The fact that it was going to be a 24-team tournament, I thought was really good. The fact that we were going to see the top four seeds on both sides was very good. So my biggest thing is we have to make sure that it's a safe environment for the players and for the coaches and for the trainers. And so they're still trying to figure that out. But I do like the fact if we do come back, there'll be 2 pods. And I think Commissioner Bettman and Bill Daly have done a phenomenal job in the NHL side of it. And Donald Fear and Matthew Schneider and Glenn Healy have done a really good job from the Players Association side. So I think both sides should be really proud of what they figured out. Now, whether they can put it into play or not comes down to the medical professionals, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, I don't want to move forward with the conversation like we're going to have a season because, as you know, when just talking with how the season ended, it changed in a matter of 24, 48 hours with the escalation of everything. But I know everyone is excited to hopefully get hockey back, so we have to get that excitement bubbling just a little bit. When you looked at those matchups, what were a couple of those first-round matchups that really stood out and you thought, hey, that's going to be a hell of a 5-game series?
Chicago-Edmonton's going to be an unbelievable series if they ever play it. I mean, those are 2 teams that probably – well, Chicago wasn't going to make the playoffs, and Edmonton was touch and go, even though they're in the weakest division, in the Pacific Division. They were touch and go to make it, but they found a way to get in. So I think that series, because of the parity, would be an amazingly tight and really fast-paced series. Carolina and New York will probably be the fastest-paced series. That'll be unbelievable with the Rangers and Carolina. Both those teams like to get up and go. I wouldn't want to be in the Pittsburgh-Montreal series only because both those teams have players coming back, and they're both going to get healthy. Jake Gensel, obviously a great USHL player coming back. After going to Nebraska, Omaha, Jake Gensel's healthy and ready to play for Pittsburgh. But Carey Price is the goalie for Montreal, Jack. And at best 3 out of 5, he could steal a series. So that would be a really tough series, very, very tough.
Do you see any part of this 24-game series, the best of 5, do you see any part of this maybe inciting a conversation to do something different with the current playoff format, taking any portion of this and translating it to the current playoff format we have?
The only thing I could see them doing is maybe reseeding, which is something they're doing here. I don't see us ever playing 3 out of 5 again. I think 4 out of 7 works phenomenally well. But I think that you could potentially see reseeding, which would be, I think, probably the most apropos way to go. But we'll see. This is a one-off. I don't think we'll see this again, Jack. So it'll be, again, interesting to see long-term how it plays out. But I think this is a one-off kind of a situation.
A couple final questions that relate to you being in between the bench during the games. What's been one of the wackiest moments that you've been a part of in between the benches?
Right at the beginning, believe it or not, I got hit over the head with a stick. It was a game between the Rangers and the Buffalo Sabres, in Buffalo. And Rip Simonek has been with the Buffalo Sabres ever since they came into the league. He's a legendary trainer. And I got hit really hard. There was a collision between two players, obviously a guy from New York and a guy from Buffalo. Alice Kodalik was a player from Buffalo. And they hit me. One of the two players hit me over the head with their stick. And I was bleeding really bad, really, really bad. And Rip goes, "Pete, you're bleeding bad." I said, "Thanks, Rip. I can feel it." He said, "You need a towel." And I said, I put my talk button on and I called the truck and I said, "Listen, do not put me on camera. I'm going to finish the period. But I'm bleeding pretty bad. I'm going to have to go in and get some stitches after the period." So I used the towel to keep the blood out of my eye, finished the period, went into the Sabres dressing room. They couldn't have been better, the doctors there, and they stitched me up. And it was funny because the players were howling. They were like, "Oh, man, you're one of us." I said, "Oh, it's not the first time I've been hit, and it probably won't be the last."
What percentage of talk do you hear between the benches that has no place of ever being on a hockey broadcast?
Percentage-wise, probably 20 to 25% that you just can't put out there. You can say they're having a discussion,
Yeah.
but there's some bad stuff from time to time, no question.
Who's one of the more colorful talkers between the benches?
Well, Brad Marchand's pretty good. Maxime Lapierre, when he was in the league, was very good. Jarkko Ruutu was maybe one of the funniest guys ever when it came to that kind of stuff. But, I think about it now, Sean Avery was pretty good at it. There's some guys that are really witty that never – Tkachuk in Calgary, Matthew Tkachuk is phenomenal at it. But, Marchand's probably the most colorful. But he's toned it down a lot over the last couple of years. I'll be honest with you. He's toned it down.
And final question as we're wrapping up this interview. You do plenty of interviews between the benches. Who are a couple of your all-time favorite guys to interview?
I like Joel Quenneville with Chicago when he was there, especially in a lot of the big games. Mike Babcock with Detroit was outstanding to deal with. Alain Vigneault has always been very, very good to deal with. Brent Sutter, when he had a short run, but Brent was good. John Tortorella, you never know what you're going to get with John. So he'd be another one that would be colorful. We don't do a lot of player interviews. We do mostly the coaches. So after games with players, one of the most thoughtful, I think, would have been Brad Richards. He's outstanding interview. Patrice Bergeron's very, very good. There are more good players than bad when it comes to interviews, to be honest.
Well, Pierre, thanks so much for taking the time today to do this interview, and we hope to see you back between the benches here with the NHL restart plan moving forward. We just don't know when it will fully solidify, but we hope to see some hockey here sooner rather than later.
Jack, I've really had a good time chatting with you. Thanks very much, and you're well on your way to having a real good career. I've really enjoyed listening to some of your broadcasts, so keep up the good work, Jack. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Pierre. Thank you.